They were told they had no voice, no rights, no future, only endless labor under the watchful eyes of those who claimed ownership over their lives. Yet history proves something extraordinary. Even in the darkest conditions imaginable, the human spirit refused to be broken. Slave rebellions did not begin with weapons or battle cries. They began with suffering, extreme oppression, forced labor from dawn to dusk, families torn apart without warning, and the total denial of basic human dignity created a reality where resistance was not a choice, it was survival. For the enslaved, obedience meant slow death. Resistance meant the possibility, however small, of reclaiming their humanity. This story is not about chaos or senseless violence. It is about courage born from desperation. It is about men and women who understood that freedom was worth risking everything for, even when the odds were stacked entirely against them. Some resisted quietly through sabotage, escape, and cultural preservation. Others rose openly, organizing revolts that shook entire empires and terrified slaveholding societies. What makes these rebellions so powerful is not just their scale, but their message. Each act of defiance shattered the myth that enslaved people accepted their fate. Every uprising exposed a simple truth: slavery could only exist through constant force, fear, and repression. And once that truth was revealed, the system itself began to crack. In this video, we will explore how slave rebellions emerged, how they were organized, and why their legacy still matters today. These stories challenge how history is often told and remind us that freedom has always been fought for, even when hope seemed impossible. If you value honest history, deep storytelling, and voices that were nearly erased, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Resistance did not always announce itself with raised voices or open confrontation. As we have already seen, rebellion was born from survival, from a world where obedience meant the slow erasure of identity and hope. Within that reality, resistance took many forms, some visible, others nearly invisible, yet all deeply intentional. Long before organized uprisings made their way into historical records, defiance was already woven into the daily lives of the enslaved. On plantations and in forced labor camps, resistance often began with the smallest acts: a slower pace in the fields, tools left deliberately damaged, crops harvested carelessly, or instructions followed just poorly enough to disrupt productivity. These actions may seem minor, but in a system built on maximum efficiency and total control, even small disruptions carried meaning. Each act declared that the enslaved were not machines, and that their labor could never be fully owned. Escape represented another powerful form of defiance, not only because it threatened economic loss, but because it challenged the very logic of bondage. Every person who ran away proved that the desire for freedom could not be contained by chains or laws. Some fled alone under cover of darkness, while others relied on secret networks, whispered directions, and shared risks. These journeys were dangerous and uncertain, yet they carried a message that echoed far beyond the individual. Slavery was neither accepted nor inevitable. At times, resistance became organized and visible, emerging as coordinated uprisings that terrified slaveholding societies. These revolts were rarely spontaneous. They required trust, planning, shared belief, and immense courage. Leaders emerged not through power, but through persuasion, often drawing on spiritual traditions, shared suffering, and visions of collective liberation. Though many uprisings were crushed, their impact extended far beyond their immediate outcomes. They forced slaveholders to confront a truth they tried desperately to deny. The system they depended on was always at risk of collapse. Equally important, though often overlooked, was the quiet resistance of cultural survival. Enslaved people preserved songs, stories, languages, and spiritual practices passed down through generations. In doing, They protected their sense of self against a system designed to strip it away. Music carried coded messages of hope and escape. Storytelling preserved history when official records erased it. Faith offered strength where laws offered none. This cultural resistance sustained communities long after individual acts of defiance faded from memory. Taken together, these forms of resistance reveal a unified struggle rather than isolated acts. Whether subtle or open, quiet or dramatic, each action pushed back against dehumanization and asserted the same truth. Enslaved people understood their condition and actively opposed it in every way available to them. Resistance was not an exception to slavery. It was a constant presence within it. By understanding resistance in all its forms, we see slave rebellions not as rare explosions of anger, but as part of an ongoing story of endurance, strategy, and moral clarity. These acts, large and small, shaped history not because they were always victorious, but because they proved that even under the harshest systems, the human spirit continues to resist being owned. As resistance grew from quiet defiance into organized action, history began to record moments when enslaved people challenged entire systems that claimed to be permanent. These moments did not appear out of nowhere. They were the natural continuation of the daily resistance already embedded in enslaved life, now expanded into collective movements that could no longer be ignored. Across different centuries and continents, these rebellions shared a common purpose: to expose the fragility of slavery by confronting it directly. In the ancient world, the revolt led by Spartacus revealed this truth with startling clarity. Enslaved as a gladiator and trained for entertainment rather than freedom, Spartacus became the symbol of a larger awakening among those trapped within the Roman system. What began as an escape grew into a sustained challenge against one of the most powerful empires of its time. Though ultimately defeated, the revolt shook Roman confidence and left behind a lasting fear that slavery, no matter how normalized, could always turn against its masters. Centuries later, that fear became reality in the Caribbean. The Haitian Revolution transformed resistance into something unprecedented, as enslaved people not only rebelled but succeeded in dismantling an entire slave-based colonial order. Born from extreme brutality and sustained exploitation, the revolution united enslaved workers, free people of color, and visionary leaders into a movement that reshaped global history. Haiti emerged not just as a symbol of rebellion, but as proof that enslaved people could overthrow slavery itself and establish a new nation founded on freedom. Its success sent shockwaves through slaveholding societies worldwide, forcing them to confront the possibility that slavery's end was not only imaginable, but achievable. In the United States, resistance took different forms under intense surveillance and repression. Nat Turner's rebellion emerged from a deeply personal and spiritual conviction that slavery violated moral law. Though the uprising was brief, its impact was profound. It intensified fear among slaveholders, led to harsher controls, and sparked fierce debates about the future of slavery. More importantly, it shattered the illusion that enslaved people were passive or content, revealing instead a simmering resistance shaped by belief, suffering, and determination. Around the same period, the Amistad uprising demonstrated resistance in yet another form, one that extended beyond plantations and into the legal and moral arena. When enslaved Africans seized control of the ship transporting them, their actions challenged not only those who held them captive, but the international systems that sustained slavery. The resulting legal battle forced courts to confront fundamental questions about freedom, justice, and human rights. Though less known than other rebellions, the Amistad case showed how resistance could travel from physical defiance into the heart of law and public opinion. What unites these rebellions is not their scale or outcome, but their shared message. Each revealed that slavery relied on constant force to survive, and that the people subjected to it were fully aware of its injustice. These were not isolated eruptions of anger, but deliberate challenges shaped by context. Leadership. and collective courage. Even when suppressed, their effects lingered, altering policies, intensifying abolitionist movements, and reshaping how societies understood the institution they once defended. By placing these rebellions within the broader story of resistance, we see them not as exceptions, but as milestones in a continuous struggle for dignity. They remind us that history moves forward not only through laws and declarations, but through the actions of those who refuse to accept a world built on their suffering. Behind every major rebellion stood individuals who understood that resistance required more than anger. It required trust, vision, and the ability to unite people who had been deliberately kept divided. As earlier forms of defiance grew into organized movements, leadership became the bridge between shared suffering and collective action. These leaders did not emerge from privilege or formal authority. They rose from the same harsh conditions as those they inspired, shaped by the very system they sought to challenge. Many of these figures drew strength from religious belief, not as an abstract doctrine, but as a language of hope that resonated deeply within enslaved communities. Faith offered meaning in a world designed to deny it, and leaders used familiar spiritual narratives to reframe suffering as something that could be endured without surrender. Stories of deliverance, justice, and moral reckoning became tools of unity, allowing people to imagine freedom not as a distant dream, but as a rightful destiny. In this way, belief transformed fear into resolve and silence into shared purpose. Others relied on military experience or practical knowledge gained through forced service. Some had been trained as soldiers, guards, or laborers within systems that unknowingly equipped them with skills of organization and strategy. They understood discipline, timing, and the importance of coordination, qualities essential for any large-scale movement. What made this leadership remarkable was not just tactical ability, but the decision to redirect those skills toward liberation rather than survival alone. Their experience revealed a deep irony. Systems built to control also produced the knowledge that made resistance possible. Equally powerful was leadership grounded in shared suffering. These leaders spoke not from distance, but from experience, articulating emotions their communities already carried. They understood the pain of separation, the exhaustion of endless labor, and the quiet despair that came from being treated as property. Because of this, their words carried authenticity. They did not need grand promises or elaborate speeches. Their credibility came from having endured the same hardships and refusing to accept them as permanent. Leadership within slave rebellions was rarely solitary. It depended on networks of trust built over time, often in secret. Leaders listened as much as they spoke, drawing strength from collective wisdom rather than imposing authority. This approach allowed movements to adapt and survive, even under constant threat. When one leader fell, others often continued the effort, proving that resistance was rooted in community rather than individual ambition. These figures also understood the risks of unity. Bringing people together in a system designed to punish cooperation required courage and restraint. Leaders had to balance urgency with caution, knowing that betrayal or exposure could have devastating consequences. Their ability to inspire action while navigating fear speaks to the extraordinary pressure under which they operated. By examining leadership within slave rebellions, we see how resistance evolved from scattered acts into coordinated challenges against slavery itself. These leaders did not create the desire for freedom. They gave it structure, language, and direction. Their influence extended beyond the moment of rebellion, shaping memory, identity, and the broader struggle for abolition. In the larger story of resistance, these charismatic figures remind us that history is not moved by force alone, but by those who can transform shared suffering into shared purpose. Through belief, experience, and empathy, they turned oppression into the foundation of organized defiance, leaving a legacy that continues to define how freedom is fought for and remembered. As rebellions grew more organized and leadership emerged from within enslaved communities, those who benefited from slavery responded with fear rather than reflection. Slaveholders and colonial authorities understood that resistance, whether quiet or open, threatened the foundation of their power. What followed was not restraint, but escalation. Control tightened, laws multiplied, and punishment became a public performance meant to warn others against following the same path. These crackdowns were not spontaneous reactions to disorder. They were calculated strategies. Colonial governments expanded patrol systems, increased surveillance, and empowered local authorities to act swiftly against any sign of collective defiance. Daily life for the enslaved became more heavily regulated, with restrictions placed on movement, gatherings, education, and communication. Even ordinary interactions were monitored, as fear spread among those who relied on slavery to sustain their wealth and status. The goal was not only to suppress rebellion, but to prevent trust and unity from forming in the first place. When rebellions were uncovered or suspected, the response was deliberately harsh. Punishments were designed to be visible and unforgettable, reinforcing the message that resistance would carry severe consequences. Leaders were singled out, not simply to remove them, but to dismantle the sense of hope they represented. Authorities believed that by making examples of those who challenged the system, they could discourage future resistance through fear alone. Yet these measures often produced the opposite effect, deepening resentment and confirming the injustice that rebels had already recognized. Legal systems played a crucial role in this process. After uprisings, colonial legislatures frequently passed stricter laws that expanded the definition of resistance and lowered the threshold for punishment. Acts that had once been tolerated, or quietly ignored, were now criminalized. Enslaved people could face severe penalties for gathering, traveling without permission, or expressing ideas deemed threatening. These laws transformed suspicion into policy, embedding fear into the structure of daily governance. What becomes clear when examining these responses is how fragile the system of slavery truly was. If slavery had been stable or morally secure, it would not have required such constant enforcement. The intensity of the crackdowns revealed a deeper anxiety. Slaveholders knew that resistance was not an exception, but an ever-present possibility. Every harsh law and public punishment acknowledged an unspoken truth that slavery depended on violence and coercion to survive. At the same time, these reactions exposed the limits of repression. Despite increased control, resistance did not disappear. Instead, it adapted. Open rebellions gave way to quieter forms of defiance, while stories of past uprisings continued to circulate in whispered conversations and shared memory. Each crackdown became part of a growing historical record that future generations would remember, interpret, and learn from. By responding to resistance with brutality and restrictive laws, slaveholding societies revealed their own moral contradictions. They claimed order and civilization, yet relied on fear to maintain authority. They demanded obedience, yet lived in constant dread of those they oppressed. In trying to silence rebellion, they documented its significance, ensuring that it would not be forgotten. Within the broader narrative of resistance, these crackdowns serve as a stark reminder that power often reacts most violently when it feels threatened. They mark the points where oppression tightened its grip, even as the desire for freedom persisted beneath the surface. Far from erasing resistance, these responses became part of the story itself, shaping how slavery would ultimately be judged, challenged, and dismantled. As resistance persisted despite harsh repression, the true nature of slavery became impossible to ignore. Rebellions did more than challenge authority in isolated moments. They revealed deep structural weaknesses within the entire system. Each uprising, whether successful or suppressed, sent a clear signal that slavery was not a stable or self-sustaining institution. It survived only through constant vigilance, escalating force, and the continuous suppression of those it sought to control. Fear became a defining feature of slaveholding societies. Authorities and landowners lived with the knowledge that rebellion could emerge from anywhere: fields, homes, ships, or workshops. This fear reshaped daily life for those in power, leading to heightened suspicion and an atmosphere of anxiety. Ordinary routines were interrupted by patrols, inspections, and rumors of unrest. The very people who claimed dominance found themselves adjusting their behavior in response to those they believed were powerless. Maintaining control also became increasingly expensive. As resistance grew more visible, slaveholders were forced to invest heavily in enforcement. Patrol systems expanded, fortifications increased, and legal frameworks grew more complex. Governments diverted resources to surveillance and punishment rather than development or stability. In many regions, the cost of maintaining slavery rose so high that its economic efficiency began to falter. What had once been justified as profitable increasingly required public funding, military involvement, and constant oversight to remain intact. Beyond financial strain, rebellions forced societies to confront uncomfortable moral contradictions. Public debates intensified as uprisings made it clear that enslaved people understood their condition and actively opposed it. Claims that slavery was benevolent or necessary grew harder to defend when faced with repeated acts of resistance. The moral language used by abolitionists gained strength, supported by undeniable evidence that those subjected to slavery rejected it at great personal risk. These moments of confrontation reached beyond local communities and into the international sphere. News of rebellions traveled across borders, influencing public opinion and political discussions far from the sites of resistance. Slaveholding nations found themselves under increasing scrutiny, as their systems of control were exposed not only as violent, but as unstable and unsustainable. The image of order that slavery relied upon began to fracture under global observation. At the same time, resistance reshaped how enslaved people were perceived within historical narratives. Rebellions demonstrated agency, strategy, and collective will, challenging portrayals of passivity. This shift in perception altered the way societies understood both slavery and freedom. Enslaved people were no longer seen merely as laborers within an economic system, but as actors who actively influenced its course. Over time, these pressures accumulated: fear, financial strain, moral challenge, and political tension combined to weaken slavery's foundations. Even where the institution persisted, it did so under growing scrutiny and diminishing legitimacy. Rebellions did not immediately end slavery, but they accelerated its unraveling by exposing truths that could no longer be concealed. Within the broader story of resistance, these moments mark a turning point. They reveal how the actions of the oppressed reshaped the systems that constrained them, not through negotiation alone, but through persistent challenge. By forcing societies to confront both the moral cost and practical limits of slavery, rebellions transformed resistance into a catalyst for change, leaving an impact that extended far beyond the moment of revolt itself. As stories of resistance spread beyond the places where rebellions occurred, their influence reached audiences far removed from the fields, plantations, and ships where bondage was enforced. News of revolts traveled through letters, newspapers, court records, and personal testimonies, carrying with it evidence that could not be easily dismissed. These accounts reshaped public conversation by revealing a reality that supporters of slavery had long attempted to conceal. Enslaved people were not passive participants in the system, but individuals who clearly understood their condition and actively sought freedom. Abolitionists seized upon these stories with urgency and purpose. In debates, speeches, and published writings, They pointed to revolts as undeniable proof that slavery was maintained against the will of those subjected to it. Each uprising undermined claims that slavery was natural, beneficial, or accepted. Instead, resistance exposed slavery as a system sustained through coercion and fear. The courage shown by those who resisted, often at great personal cost, strengthened moral arguments that slavery violated fundamental principles of justice and human dignity. These narratives also helped abolitionists humanize enslaved people in the eyes of broader society. Rather than abstract figures in economic discussions, the rebels became individuals with beliefs, motivations, and a clear desire for self-determination. Their actions challenged deeply rooted stereotypes and forced audiences to confront the reality that enslaved people valued freedom as profoundly as anyone else. This shift in perception was essential, as it reframed the debate from one about property and profit to one about human rights and moral responsibility. Resistance also exposed contradictions within pro-slavery narratives. Supporters of slavery often portrayed the institution as stable and orderly, yet the very need for constant enforcement and harsh punishment contradicted those claims. Abolitionists highlighted how revolts revealed instability and fear within slaveholding societies, demonstrating that slavery could not exist without continuous repression. These arguments gained credibility as more rebellions occurred and more evidence accumulated. International attention amplified this effect. Reports of uprisings crossed borders and influenced discussions in countries grappling with their own involvement in slavery. In some cases, resistance abroad accelerated reform movements at home, as political leaders and citizens recognized the risks and moral consequences of maintaining the institution. Revolts became part of a global conversation, linking local acts of defiance to wider struggles for justice and reform. Importantly, abolitionists did not present rebellions as isolated or irrational acts. They framed them as logical responses to extreme conditions, rooted in shared human values. By contextualizing resistance within the broader experience of oppression, they helped audiences understand why rebellion emerged and why it persisted despite brutal consequences. This framing made the argument against slavery more persuasive, grounded in empathy rather than fear. Over time, the accumulation of these stories weakened the ideological foundation of slavery. Public opinion shifted gradually, influenced by repeated reminders that the enslaved rejected their status and resisted it whenever possible. Even those previously indifferent were forced to reckon with the evidence placed before them. Within the larger narrative of resistance, the spread of news about revolts transformed local defiance into a powerful tool for change. By amplifying the voices and actions of those who resisted bondage, abolitionists reshaped the moral landscape. Resistance was no longer confined to the moment of rebellion. It lived on in arguments, debates, and movements that pushed societies closer to confronting slavery's injustice and imagining a different future. As we look back across the long history of slave rebellions, what endures most strongly is not only the events themselves, but what they represent. These rebellions stand as powerful symbols of courage, agency, and human dignity in the face of systems designed to erase all three. They remind us that freedom has never been granted freely. It has been claimed, defended, and imagined by those who were told they did not deserve it. Slave rebellions reshape how we understand resistance. They show that resistance is not defined solely by victory or defeat, but by the refusal to accept injustice as normal. Even when rebellions were suppressed, their meaning could not be undone. Each act of defiance affirmed a simple truth. Enslaved people recognized their own humanity and acted to protect it. That recognition alone challenged the moral foundations of slavery more powerfully than any argument written on paper. These stories also shape modern ideas of human rights. Today, freedom, equality, and dignity are often discussed as universal values. But history reveals that these principles were forged through struggle. Slave rebellions exposed the contradiction between societies that claimed liberty while denying it to millions. By confronting that contradiction, Resistance helped push the world toward broader definitions of rights that extend beyond race, status, or origin. The legacy of these rebellions lives on in how we remember the past and how we confront injustice in the present. They teach us that systems of oppression rely not only on power, but on silence, and that resistance begins the moment silence is broken, whether through quiet endurance or open defiance. Enslaved people shaped history by insisting on their worth, even when the cost was unimaginable. Remembering slave rebellions is not about glorifying conflict. It is about honoring truth. It is about recognizing the people who refused to disappear, who acted with courage in circumstances that tested the limits of human endurance. Their stories remind us that progress is rarely comfortable and never accidental. As this story comes to a close, we are left with a deeper understanding of freedom not as an abstract idea, but as something lived, defended, and fought for by real people. Slave rebellions are not distant echoes of the past. They are foundations upon which modern struggles for justice continue to stand. Thank you for taking the time to listen and reflect on these stories. If you found this journey meaningful and believe these voices deserve to be remembered, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps ensure that history is told with honesty, depth, and respect.